Hi, everyone. Thank you guys for all attending this rescheduled event with Dr. David Gerlach. Hopefully no technical difficulties today. But again, Dr. Gerlach will be talking about lessons from Nazi Germany, race-based nationalism, and the rise of a demagogue. And so before I turn it over to Dr. Gerlach, I just wanted to promote a couple more events that are happening this week as well as next week. So tonight is the Black Action Committee's art show. So they're having an art contest and exhibition. Janine, if you have, I don't know if you have the link, but if you do, could you please drop it into the chat? If not, I'll find it and I'll drop it into the chat. But again, tonight is the exhibition. Submissions closed on Monday, and so it'll be a nice event just to support students, faculty, and staff who have submitted artwork that runs the gamut in relationship to Black history. Also, this Friday, tomorrow, there'll be an event with Mariame Kaba. This is not the right one. Sorry, I have too many things on my screen. We do this till we free us, and that will start at 2 p.m. via Zoom. For more information, please shoot myself or Gabriella Ambrose an email to get access to the Zoom link. This will be a deep conversation about abolition, abolitionist organizing, as well as how we can transform justice, especially in light of everything that's happened around us in the last few weeks. But last but not least, last plug, I promise, is the, Connecting Parallels event. Just give me 2 seconds to find this one. Okay. And so with Connecting Parallels, this event will focus primarily on the interconnections between Palestinian struggles around, showing you all my business, Palestinian struggles around medical apartheid and the connections that we have between the US as well as Palestine. And so this is occurring on March 3rd from 12 to 2 p.m. There's a registration link, which I'll drop in the chat towards the end of today's lecture, okay? And so with that said, with all that fun plugging, I will turn it over to Dr. David Gerlach.
Great, thank you much. So can I also share my screen now too? Is that? All right, it says I can. All right, great, welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming. Let me see how this works out. All right. Okay. So here we are, 21st century, looking back to the last century to think about what we might be able to learn from that. When I was first asked to give this talk, I was a bit skeptical, only because as historians, we're uncomfortable making, or we should be uncomfortable making, broad generalizations over space and time. At the same time, I do, sort of like the adage that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, right? So, you often hear that history repeats itself. That's never the case, right? But the rhymes are something we should learn from. Unfortunately, we rarely do. But I think, looking at these two cases, I'm hopeful that we will be able to think more critically about where we are and have that kind of a discussion. As I decided to put this together and focus on a couple of specific things, that is this idea of race-based nationalism and this idea of the demagogue, I sort of thought, rather than trying to be very explicit about the comparisons or the similarities and differences, I'd kind of leave that in your hands as the audience. What do you see after my talk that would be, something you consider similar to what's going on today versus, something that we see in the German case that is very different from what we have here in our own world in 2021. So with that being said, those caveats, if you will, I'm going to talk a little bit first, just generally about the history of this period in German history, okay? And then I'll get into a little bit more of the issues of nationalism and demagoguery, all right, or what this looks like. So we start sort of at the end here for me. The Reichstag fire, the Reichstag is the word for the parliament in Germany, okay? The Reichstag fire happened in February 1933, just after Hitler had become chancellor in Germany, okay? And I'll kind of get to that story in a little bit. The Nazis comprised the largest party, but not a majority party in this multi-party system that they had set up after the war in their democracy, okay? But they used the fire, and there's a lot of conflict about the fire, still unknown facts, who set it off, why, but they used the fire at the parliament. Again, it was an arsenic event, to kind of clamp down and really end democracy once and for all. They lied, first and foremost, and blamed it on their political enemies, the communists. And that allowed them to crack down on the communists and the socialist parties to a degree as well. It also then was the stepping stone to give Hitler the right to rule by decree, which happened then a month later. And so it's this is sort of the end point then when democracy really collapses in Germany during the interwar period. And it's a period, it's not what we're calling Nazi Germany, but really it's known as the Weimar Republic, this period of German history between World War I and World War II, okay? So that's where we're going. How do we get there? Germany was created in 1871, sort of led by the state Prussia at that time. I'm sure some of you have heard of that. And Prussia kind of put together then these other German states, duchies, principalities, kingdoms. In the case of Bavaria there in the south, we're going to come back to Bavaria. So you can see that one here, one of the last standing kingdoms in the German lands. And the state of Germany was also formed through warfare. 1870, it was the Franco-Prussian War, as it was called, and that ended in 1871. And that was when, in fact, Germany became a state at the end of that war. They also happened to take some territory from France, known as Alsace-Lorraine. You see that here in the West. And that will be a continued sticking point for relations between France and Germany going into the interwar period. Before World War I, and would be in fact one of the causes of World War I, this kind of antagonism or enmity between France and Germany that existed after the Franco-Prussian War, and as well, obviously a little bit before then. So I don't really have time here to go into the causes of World War I very much, other than to, kind of just lay out the very bare bones to say that, everyone thought they would be home before Christmas. Most European wars had been short wars, okay? Here you see a group of German soldiers heading off to the front, painted on their train there at the bottom. It says from Munich through Metz to Paris, okay? So the idea that they would quickly reach Paris and that they would be home in time for Christmas. The war had started in August 1914. The war obviously lasts much longer than everyone expected. And as it drags on, more and more people really on every side are against it. The Germans face great deprivations on the home front. And, most Germans were at least against the war in the sense of what it had done to them in their country. Many men are dying at the front, et cetera, et cetera. But yet, as late as 1918, there's still promised victory, okay? The media was very heavily censored in Germany at this time. Again, it's not a democracy, so you have a king who's ruling the country, but really it was the leadership, the military leadership that controlled things, okay? But as the war drags on, there are efforts and thoughts about ending the war, coming to some kind of negotiated peace. But again, the German military leadership was really not interested in this. They controlled sort of the king in a way and the political situation back in Germany. And so they kept demanding maximalist war aims, as they were called, lots of territory, lots of money, and so forth. And there was reason still in 1918 for hope. That is that Germany might actually win. If you notice on the, and you can see sort of the map here, German allies in lighter yellow. But in March 1918, they had knocked Russia out of the war and instituted the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. You see this black line, that's all the territory that they took from Russia as a result of that treaty, okay? And I'll come back to that point a little bit later. But this defeating Russia on the Eastern Front allowed them then to shift all of their forces to the Western Front and face, the British and French primarily at that time. However, they had also begun unrestricted warfare, submarine warfare against the Americans well, not directly against the Americans, but it was what would bring America back into the war on the side of the French and British in 1918. And this would ultimately tip the balance against Germany. But still, in the summer, fall of 1918, most Germans expect that they're going to win this war. The military leaders, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff, are also more or less convinced that Germany can still win the war as late as the summer of 1918. By August, however, October really, they tell the king, nope, we have to sue for peace. We're not going to be able to win after all. Now, rather than accept the blame for this, they shift blame and responsibility for ending the war onto the new incoming government that's going to be led by the socialists. Again, there had been a parliament, even though there was sort of a constitutional monarchy, not exactly, but there had been political parties and they had a voice and they had been pushing for a more reasonable peace solution earlier on. But they were seen, when they did this, as weak and defeatist, okay? So all of this is really important because when the war ends, most Germans are caught by surprise. They don't expect this, and they now think, what's going on here? And there's a lot of room for conspiracy theories. And the conspiracy theory that the conservative leaders in the country and the military leadership drum up is that it was the fault of the socialists for signing the peace deal with the British and the French. And this left them, this was kind of the first big lie then that the conservative right begins to promote in post-war Germany. And this would become repeated again and again. And it's the lie that they were stabbed in the back, okay? That Germany was stabbed in the back by their own people, socialists primarily and communists, okay? And this was something that would, again, gain great traction throughout the interwar period, all right? So after the war ends, the country is sort of in turmoil. There are attempted overthrows by communist leaders and groups throughout the country. In Bavaria, for example, a communist dictatorship is declared for a short time. In Berlin, the communists organize what's known as the Spartacist uprising, where they attempt to take over the country and institute a communist dictatorship, much like what had just happened in Russia in 1917. The communists didn't like the Bolshevik methods of violence that they had used to take power in Russia, but they also didn't like the idea of trying to get to communism through parliamentary means. And so they were willing to take to the streets, take up arms, and fight for this attempted overthrow of, or attempted, institution of a communist power in Germany. It fails miserably. They spend a lot of time talking and issuing leaflets and things like that, but don't really do much to plan for and get themselves ready for any kind of fight against counter-revolutionary forces, if we want to call them that, or forces on the right. And what happens is the socialist government that is a part of the coalition government, and the leader here at the time would happen to be a socialist, calls in the military and rightist paramilitary forces to put down the uprising. The leader of the socialists, a guy by the name of Friedrich Ebert, had said, "I hate revolution like the plague." And so a couple of things we should note here. Socialists and communists are not the same thing. The socialists, not all socialists want a revolution. And it was often the moderate Socialist Party that was willing to crack down more heavily on its rivals on the right, on the left-hand side of the political spectrum, other socialists and communists, for example, than they were actively trying to keep the right in check. Okay, and this is something we'll see again and again here. Now, one of the groups that emerged on the right after the war is known as the Free Corps. It draws its name from the Napoleonic Wars back in the early 19th century. And it was put together towards the end of World War I by the military with the thought that they're going to need a sort of peacekeeping force back in Germany, as well as a force to crush the leftist revolutionaries. And so the military leaders are directly involved in kind of putting this together. This is a poster for joining the Free Corps saying, "Protect your homeland," okay, join the Free Corps. And many did sign up. It became quite a large force, but they were really not under any civilian control. The government did not, really control this force. They sort of took orders from the military, but even that was sort of loose. And it was, again, a symbol and a sign of one of the weaknesses in Weimar Germany, that these paramilitary forces were essentially left to their own devices and allowed to exist, and even relied upon in certain cases to put down leftist revolutions, okay? And indeed, when they came in and crushed the Spartacist uprising, they left several thousand dead. These were really battle-hardened soldiers who had fought on the Western Front in the spring and summer of 1918 in particular, okay? And so these guys will be around throughout the interwar period. So the post-war situation then is very much in flux. You have these attempted communist revolutions on the one hand, and as we'll see in a minute, we're gonna, you have these groups of rightist revolutionaries also considering and plotting for the overthrow of the government, okay? The government itself wasn't set up as a democracy. Again, multi-party, so you had several different parties. I'm not going to go into each one of them. You had universal suffrage. Women got the right to vote, for example. The king had abdicated as part of the end of the war and these communist revolutions as well. And so they went straight from, kind of this having a king into this democratic system, and not everyone bought into it. In fact, there were a lot of people that still wanted to see the monarchy, for example, around. And then there were also regional differences that were sort of undermined by this attempt at unity, and unifying all of the governments that had existed beforehand under one rubric. But the big sticking point was the Treaty of Versailles. So the treaty did a lot of things, and it's important to maybe talk about it for a minute. But one of the things it did was to strip Germany of some territory. And this map shows then all of the various pieces of territory that Germany lost as a result of World War I. You can see Alsace-Lorraine there in the west was given back to France, for example. But the most important piece here is this large one in the east that was given to Poland. And in that region, there were a lot of it was kind of mixed German speakers, Polish speakers, again, sort of an ethnically mixed area. And it had always been sort of a contention about which country should have it. But Poland, as a state that was being recreated after World War I, the Allies, as they're putting this together, or again, the winners of the war technically weren't called the Allies, they were the Entente powers, but I don't want to confuse everyone. They felt that the Poles should have an access to the sea. And so you can see that there's a corridor there that splits actually Germany in two, with East Prussia province here in the east, and then the rest of Germany in the west. And there was this territory that was lost that was really hard for Germans to swallow, okay, and was just one part of the great resentment that built up towards the reasons of the war ending the way it did and the treaty itself, okay. And this again would be something then that would actually unite many Germans together in their sense of trying to get back something that they had lost, okay? And there were a lot of other stipulations that you might know about with the Treaty of Versailles, for example, the war guilt clause that suggested that Germany had started the war. There were large reparation payments that Germany was supposed to pay as well. But we should remember the Germans themselves had, with that Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, had actually taken more territory from Russia and demanded more money from them than the Germans were facing after the Treaty of Versailles. In addition, the Germans, themselves were pushing for maximalist war aims as late as the summer of 1918. So there was no sense of the relative nature of their punishment, or thinking about it in relative terms, I guess. And many just saw it as an absolute kind of aberration that needed to be dealt with, okay? And this would be something then too that Hitler and the Nazis would be able to use to gain support during this interwar period. But the right, like I said, was also ready to overthrow this new Weimar democracy, okay? The first attempt comes in 1920. It's known as the Kapp Putsch. And in this case, the military was directly involved. A lot of the leaders of the putsch, or the coup, were military leaders, and they essentially rolled right into Berlin and took over the seats of power, at least. The cabinet had been tipped off to the coup and had left to a nearby town, Dresden, and they were able to organize loyal political and military forces to help come back and essentially threaten to arrest the coup leaders. And the coup leaders also couldn't really drum up the necessary local support to actually run the government. The communists ordered workers on strike, and basically the government shut down as a result of this attempted overthrow. The leaders escaped, though, for the most part, abroad. One leader was caught and sentenced to 5 years in prison. And most of the other kind of lower level paramilitary guys, members of the Free Corps that were involved in the putsch, were later given amnesty, and many of them joined the military again later in 1922, for example, okay? The next coup attempt, or putsch attempt, was known as the Beer Hall Putsch. And this was the one that involved Hitler and the Nazi Party directly. So the Nazi Party began actually as the German Workers' Party in 1919. Hitler later sort of took control of the party in 1920 and renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party. So he added that National Socialist part to the beginning of that title. And it was more branding than anything else, really. But it was an effort to kind of appeal to the workers, but also, appeal beyond the workers to everybody through this idea of a national party. But Hitler, again, was not one who liked democracy at all. And there were plenty on the right who did not. But he thought and believed that they could try a kind of a different coup. And this happens again a couple of years later in 1923, where based on the model that Mussolini had carried out in Rome in 1922, the so-called March on Rome. So Hitler's idea was that they would take power in Munich, okay, again, the capital city of Bavaria. And from there, they would march on Berlin. And along the way, thousands of people would join them, and they would kind of have this show of force and show up in Berlin and be able to take power and end the democratic experiment that was the Weimar Republic. Now, I'm not going to go into the details here too much. You can see, though, this is a different leader speaking to the crowds in Munich, and there were quite a lot of people behind this. Hitler and the party had about 2,000 kind of armed guys ready to fight. But they end up, getting into some skirmishes with the local police. The military is called in and backup. In the end, about 16 Nazis die, 4 policemen are killed. And, the leaders flee, some are arrested. Hitler's later arrested. and they are put on trial. So the effort itself is seen as a kind of bumbled one, and one that doesn't really work, but it did have some important consequences. First and foremost, it gave Hitler a kind of national spotlight. Until this time, he was really a very fringy right-wing guy at the head of a very weak party, kind of very provincial party in Munich, where there were lots of other fringy parties that were sort of weak and rightist, and so they didn't really stand out. But the attempted coup itself, followed by the trial, really catapulted him into the national spotlight for the first time. Okay, and the other thing is that the trial that he faced kind of similarly gave him this new platform to speak to the German people. And at his trial, at the end, he says, "Gentlemen, it is not you who pronounce judgment upon us. It is the external court of history which will make its pronouncements upon the charge brought against us. That court will judge us as Germans who wanted the best for their people and their fatherland, who wished to fight and die. You may pronounce us guilty 1,000 times, but the goddess who presides over the eternal court of history will, with a smile, tear in pieces the charge of the public prosecutor and the verdict of this court, for she acquits us." And indeed, they may as well have acquitted him. I mean, they sentenced him to 5 years again for high treason, but he serves only a term, and he's eligible for parole after a year, and he ends up serving about 13 months total. And this was something, again, a failure of the Weimar justice system that we see again and again. In one study, a scholar had followed, for example, the cases of murder trials by right-wing activists and left-wing activists, and he found that in 354 trials for right-wing activists, murder trials, I should point out, 326 times the accused was acquitted. Whereas for left-wing activists, in 22 murder cases, there were only 4 acquittals. And even the number of cases should give us pause here in terms of the differences of right-wing murder versus left-wing murder. Overall length of sentences also show this vast discrepancy, where on the right, the length of a sentence was on average 4 months, and on the left, the average was 15 years. So again, we see this kind of really lopsided handing out of justice. The numbers of killed also point this out. The Spartacus uprising and various strike actions that were organized by the left left thousands dead, whereas the Free Corps only saw a few hundred dead over the entire course of the Weimar Republic. So back to Hitler for a minute. The one thing that his time in jail allowed him to do, in addition to writing his book Mein Kampf, My Struggle, was to give him a second thought on tactics as well. And he decided that rather than try an armed uprising, they would join the government and try to win through parliamentary means. Okay, and so the Nazi Party then kind of regroups and begins this big propaganda push, now with a kind of national leader in the spotlight who is really, really good at what he does, and that is give speeches and talk about what the problems of Germany were. This slide just shows the leaders of the beer hall putsch, as it was known. I should point out the gentleman next to Hitler here, this gentleman on his left was Erich Ludendorff, okay, the same general that was fighting, leading the war in World War I. And so that's what gave Hitler sort of the ability and the backing to carry out this push in the first place. Okay, so with Weimar then, so the Nazis begin organizing, they begin going on in politics. The 20s were a little rough at the beginning. You had this period of very high inflation that I'm sure many of you know about, where people would push wheelbarrows of Reichmarks, dollars kind of thing, around just to buy their groceries because inflation was so out of control. But by the mid-20s, things calm back down. The reparation payments have been reduced and kind of reorganized. And Germany's sort of on its way. They have a sort of roaring late 20s, much like we had here in the United States. But then everything comes crashing down with the Great Depression, okay? 1929, Germany is even at more risk because they have borrowed a lot of money in part to, fund their economy, but also to make reparation payments. When those outside sources of funding dry up, they're really left on their own. Unemployment, which was about 8.5% in 1929, by 1930s up to 14%. By 1932, about 43% of the industrial workforce is unemployed. So really, really stark and dramatic effects that the Great Depression had. And this would radicalize politics again in the late 20s and early 30s in Germany, okay? Politics were kind of both on the street and in the parliament, okay? And this was, again, the kind of radical nature of politics during this period of time. Here you have the SA, or the Storm Detachment, as it's known, the Nazi kind of brown shirts, as they're also known, where they dressed up in these uniforms. They had their flags. You can see all the kind of imagery here, their salute. Again, very much a militarized group of people, but one that was actually just part of a political party, that is the Nazis. The communists too had their sort of militarized wing as well, known as the Alliance of the Red Front Fighters here, okay? And they brawled all the time. Street fighting was common. Here we have a fight in a beer hall around this time in the late Weimar era, and things are really starting to disintegrate. By 1930, the president at the time, who was Hindenburg, that same general that was leading World War I, had decided to invoke Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, which allowed him to dissolve parliament and appoint chancellors directly. And so basically from 1930, again, in the throes of the Great Depression, politics began to break down, and the government is no longer really operating as a parliamentary system. In some ways, we might argue that things ended at this point for German democracy. But it goes on, and it's through this process then that Hitler is given the chancellorship finally in early 1932. I lose my time? No, that's right. Early January 1932. So again, between 1930 and 1932, there's a succession of chancellors, each one trying to figure out a way to get a parliamentary majority together. None are able to do so. And we have a series of elections then that sees the increased popularity at the fringes, okay? And so I'm showing you this overall table here of all the political parties, but I've highlighted what I want us to pay attention to. And that's sort of back in 28, before the Great Depression, the Nazis were still very much a fringe party, commanding very little support overall. Things change rapidly though, right? September 1930, again, the Depression's already going. They gain about 18% of the popular vote. 1932 in July, though, is when they reach their highest majority, or highest number of about 37% of the vote. And it's at that time, where Hitler believes he can still get a majority, so he holds out for another election. But you can see that their support begins to drop. And it's at this point that Hindenburg, the president, and wealthy businessmen and other conservative political leaders make the fateful decision to agree to give her the chancellorship. They surround him with men in the cabinet they believe will keep him in check, and that the conservatives can kind of manage Hitler and not the other way around, okay? But with the Reichstag fire then that follows, all those plans go out the window, and Hitler becomes chancellor. At that point, he pushes through what's known as the Enabling Act, which allows him to essentially rule by decree. And this was done, again, by extra parliamentary means. By that point, they had imprisoned all the communist deputies, as well as 26 of the socialist deputies, and that allowed him to carry the 2/3 majority in parliament that he needed to push through this Enabling Act. And with that, democracy in Germany was over. Okay, so I'd like to just shift gears a little bit then and talk about how central nationalism was both to Hitler's ideology, but also to his plans and the way that this also sort of resonated with the people of Germany at that time. I'll skip that one. There's Hitler becoming chancellor, sort of Hindenburg on the right, the famous handshake, okay? So if we think about nationalism, European nationalism, I always talk about it in class, a little bit different than what we maybe associate with white nationalism today. There are definitely some similarities and things I'd like to talk about, but we should remember that for European nationalists, it was a way that they could tie this idea of we the people or democratic legitimacy to their situation and this idea of a nation. And so what I mean by that is political elites sort of argued that the nation was the true bearer of democratic legitimacy, and that nation was we the people. So some similarities there, but they also had a rather limited notion of what the nation was. And so this idea at the bottom here, where a nation's a group of people with shared common beliefs and blah, 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 we can sort of add some things to that, was one that was a guiding force. And so we have a kind of tension here at the beginning of this idea of nation, where it's this group of people with shared common history, traits, et cetera, that sounds like a good thing. And it's also the basis for democratic promotion of this idea of democracy, right? That the people should have the right to rule. But the tension is that for most of the European countries, nations weren't defined. There wasn't a clear definition of what a nation was or who belonged. And with this kind of basic accepted idea of what the nation was, it meant that others did not belong. And so in the post-war situation of World War I, where they redraw the map of Europe and all of these new borders, you have states that are, at least on the face of it, national, Germany, Poland, and so on. But within all of those states, there are large groups of minorities that now are at risk. And indeed, one of the things we see that happens in the interwar period is a lot of the majority nations or the ruling nations institute policies that are sort of favor majority groups over minorities. And this is what one sociologist, Michael Mann, has called the dark side of democracy, that in democracies, in theory, democracies are good things, but when the democracy is based on national divisions, minority nations or ethnicities are often at risk for not only policies that go against them, but perhaps even more violent extremes like ethnic cleansing and genocide, okay? Now, alongside these ideas of nationalism, and just to point out a couple of odd features maybe of German nationalism, they took a lot of their inspiration from Roman and Greek, ancient Roman and ancient Greek ideas here. So you see this this is a representation of Germania in a female version, you know, and you can tell they're going off to this parade. In terms of architecture, you have these kind of national monuments that get built, very Romanesque here in this case, right, or Greek, both. The Hermannsdenkmal is a great example. Again, these are older, but this is based on the myth that this German leader, Hermann, took on the Roman legions back in whatever date it was and defeated them on the battlefield in the hundreds sometime, I don't know, 300 something probably, okay. One of my ancient historians friends can correct me on this, but you know, and what's sort of odd about the Roman and Greek thing is that, especially with the Romans, is they saw again the Germanic tribes as this origin myth of Germans, right? And so there's a lot of invented tradition going on here, as one historian calls it, where this idea that we all belong together, this idea of a nation, is really built on very thin ground in many cases. Most people didn't see themselves as German until very late, until the 20th century, okay? But this myth-making project happens much earlier, and some of it is culturally kind of benign, but a lot of it is politically driven as well, okay? The Nazis, I should point out, continued this kind of myth making, and you know, again, all of the symbology here, we see it in architecture, draws on that German nationalist theme, those German nationalist themes that had been in existence already for a generation or two. So is sort of a place where we want to think about that. Now, alongside of nation runs this idea of race. And this, for the Nazis, there was this idea of the Aryan, okay, or the kind of white man that was considered the superior race among all humans. And the emergence of race science built on, you know, the kind of in the wake of Charles Darwin and his findings about different species of animals were believed to be cutting edge science around 1900. And ideas about removing impurities, for example, took hold and became a focus for many, not only in Europe, but also in the United States. And you can see here this woman, she was an anthropologist measuring the head of a Romani woman. This notion, this completely bogus idea that you could kind of scientifically categorize the different races of humans in the same way that you might do that species, for example. But this was quite widely accepted, okay? And eugenics, a kind of offshoot of this whole deal, was an important force in interwar Europe and beyond, like I said. For Hitler and the Nazis, racial purification was a central goal. And so it helps explain, too, why Jews were not the only ones targeted by the Holocaust. In fact, the first victims were the mentally and physically disabled that were killed and sterilized and went through those processes, okay? And, you know, others, too, were seen as lesser than. For example, Slavic peoples to the east, Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, those. And the Nazis had a fairly complex racial hierarchy, but all of it built on old stereotypes and prejudices, but again, with this new infusion of scientific thinking going along right with it. And Hitler picked up on all this. In as early as 1919, he writing to a comrade, he wrote, "To begin with, Jewry is unqualifiedly a racial association and not a religious association. Its influence will bring about the racial tuberculosis of the people." And a lot of the language then kind of follows along the same trajectory. The program of the German Workers' Party, again, the predecessor to the Nazis, but Hitler was very much in charge at this point when they were drafting the program in 1920, you know, excludes the Jews specifically. And the Jews were central to Hitler's ideology of racial purification and moving on. And he was not alone. Again, this built on generations of stereotypes about the Jews, okay? And those stereotypes were flexible. And this was one of the things that made them powerful. You had the poor Jew, for example, who was a beggar and associated with communism. You can see there on the gentleman's left shoulder, the hammer and sickle there to the east. And so that was one way the Jews were portrayed. They were also portrayed as the rich, you know, wealthy that were keeping down the poor peasants, and always, you know, they're willing to steal from the rich capitalists, right? If it were, as it were, and it was a way in which this idea of the Jew as a danger took real hold in Nazi propaganda in particular, but it was not only them, okay, that believed all of this, and it wound its way in strange ways. I mean, they talked about this very oddly. For example, Joseph Goebbels had the following to say in a speech in 1928: "Nationalism is the doctrine of blood, of race. The Jew is the enemy and the destroyer of unity created by blood, the deliberate destroyer of our race. As nationalists, we are enemies of the Jews because in the Hebrew, we see the eternal enemy of our national honor and our national freedom." Now, if you break that all down, there's not a lot of sense there. It's a lot of rhetoric. It's a lot of simple statements, okay, that, but it shows the flexibility in this approach to their rhetoric about the Jew and the way that they could portray the Jew in these various ways that would resonate with the people to a high degree, but also kind of they could speak it in terms of racial science, okay, which gave it the veneer of legitimacy, and again, building on centuries of anti-Semitism, okay? Now, I'd like to just shift for the last little bit here to talk about what a demagogue is. And I pulled together a few different definitions here. I'll take any one of these, so you guys can take your pick. But the basic idea is clear. Okay. And it seemed to me one of the very clear parallels that we might be able to make between past and present in this case. Now, I'm not saying that Trump is Hitler, but they're both certainly demagogues. Okay. And in that sense, we can compare them. Hitler liked to practice his speeches and his speech giving. And if we weren't on Zoom, I'd play a clip from one of his speeches. And even if you didn't understand German, you would get how his speeches were powerful and how he was able to wind up a crowd, if you will. And Hitler was really good at propaganda. He had this to say about it in his book, Mein Kampf. The receptivity of the great masses is very limited. Their intelligence is small, but their power of forgetting is enormous. In consequence of these facts, all effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points and must harp on these in slogans until the last member of the public understands what you want him to understand by your slogan. Okay. And I think this kind of summarizes very well why the sloganeering is repeated and repeated and repeated endlessly. We shouldn't forget that once the Nazis get in power, it's almost 5-6 years before they make their first move internationally. And again, repeating the lie again and again is only going to make it that much more effective. The stab in the back, something Hitler always liked to talk about. For example, in one of his speeches in 1923, a British reporter quoted Hitler as saying, "How can we help the fatherland? I'll tell you how, by hanging the criminals of November 18." Okay, and that was his shorthand for talking about them. And you can see here, they would blend the imagery, with their anti-Semitism as well. A lot of socialists were, or I should put it this way, a lot of Jews participated in leftist politics, particularly socialist or communist politics, because it was international, right? They didn't put a nationalist label on it or exclude them in the ways that many conservative rightist parties would. And again, this lie was something that wasn't an invention of Hitler's, but one that he was able to capitalize on better than many of his other conservative politicians. He also promoted this idea of the lying press endlessly, okay, the so-called Lügenpresse. And when they called him out on his lies, Hitler would just simply deflect and say, well, this is just another example of the lying press, okay? Another example or important element of demagoguery is this deep devotion and allegiance of his followers, okay? And the Nazis believed in this thing called the Führer principle. The Führer is this word, means leader, okay? And this poster is obviously a little bit later after Hitler's already in power, but this notion of one people, one empire, one leader was built into and baked into the Nazi propaganda, such that Hitler was more important than any facet of the program that they promoted or even the kind of specific leadership roles. So, one thing that happened was they instituted the Führer oath for the military after they took power in 1934, if you were in the military, this is the oath that you would take. I swear by Almighty God, this sacred oath, I will render unconditional obedience to the Führer of the German Reich and people, Adolf Hitler, Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht, and as a brave soldier, I will be ready at any time to stake my life for this oath. No mention of staking your life for an oath on Germany itself, or maybe the chancellorship or the president or whatever. It's on Adolf Hitler, okay? Now, the other thing about a demagogue too that connects with Hitler, one other thing I'd like to mention is this notion that a British historian talked about known as working toward the Führer, okay? And the idea was that Hitler didn't have to give specific commands to his followers to get policies put in place, okay? They knew what he wanted. He said it endlessly. He repeated himself again and again. I mean, his policy ideas were fairly limited in fact, okay? And they heard his speeches, again, hundreds of them over and over again. It was clear what he wanted. And so this idea of working toward the Führer meant that his subordinates actually, they were the ones that then tried to pick up and think about, well, what does he actually want us to do? And they'd fight each other to try and do it first to curry favor with him. And this led to a very disorganized system, to be honest, not something we associate with the Nazis very often, but the government was a complete mess. And Hitler, in a sense, wanted it that way because then he could pick and choose, the people he wanted, the policies he wanted, without having to go out and explicitly kind of come up with them on his own. And so, there are several other elements of Nazism that drew people in, okay? The flags, the rallies, the waving flags and torchlight parades, all in the military uniforms, right? All kind of gave this sense of pageantry that appealed to certain members of the German population. And, it created this sense of belonging and purpose. That purpose ultimately sought to end democracy, attack Jews and foreigners, and make Germany great again. So if I maybe end here, what do we take from all this? What are the lessons to be learned from Germany in the interwar period? Well, I'm not sure I have a bunch of great answers, but I'll give you three kind of basic ideas. First, that we haven't come all that far. Age-old prejudices and ideologies and superstitions are still very much with us. And we can talk more about all of this later. Second, democracies need a well-educated and well-informed public. Sadly, this is obviously not the case today. Our education system is in shambles and the media now has been more or less discredited. And the third thing I'd say is that democracy is fragile. When people directly challenge its legitimacy, they should be demonstrably punished. Otherwise, we're inviting to have them do that again. And I think that's one lesson for sure that we can see happen in the case of Germany. So I'd like to stop at this point then. Thank you all for listening, and I'd like more to hear about what you guys all have to say.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Gerlach. That was really in-depth, and I think it perfectly helped to bridge some of the conversations that we were having yesterday with Dr. Johnson, and so it serves as, two good bookend pieces. So now I'm going to open the event to questions and comments. As noted on the flyer, this is a longer conversation, so folks, please feel free to stay on to keep the conversation going. We'll start first with students, and then we'll move over to faculty, staff, and admin and other guests. Please feel free to also use the chat and use the raise hand feature in order to ask a question. Oh, and Dr. Gerlach, could you also just stop recording just so folks can feel comfortable asking questions and so on and so forth?